Before we dive in, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment, because what you're about to hear is one of the darkest, most unbelievable whistleblower stories ever to come out of Rikers Island. They found him standing in the hallway of the George R. Vierno Center, shaking, pale, and drenched in sweat. A rookie correction officer with only months on the job. But what terrified him wasn't an inmate, or a riot, or even a weapon. It was his own colleagues. Minutes earlier, Manuel Calvelos had walked into something he was never meant to see. A beating so brutal, so methodically hidden, that it confirmed what many suspected but were too afraid to say out loud. And when he tried to report it, when he followed the rules exactly as the department claimed officers should, the retaliation began immediately. His locker was broken into. His radio malfunctioned while he was on post. Someone smashed his car windshield in the employee parking lot. And then came the message written on a torn slip of paper stuffed into his uniform pocket: "Mind your business." What Manuel didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. The whispers, the threats, the cover-ups. Every step he took toward the truth pushed him closer to the edge of a system that had swallowed stronger men before him. And somewhere inside Rikers, someone had already decided he wasn't going to make it to the end of his shift. But to understand how Manuel ended up moments away from losing everything, his job, his safety, and possibly his life, you need to know where this nightmare started. It began on his first week inside Rikers Island, long before he realized that the danger wasn't the inmates, but the people wearing the same uniform as him. Manuel Calvelos had always believed that a uniform meant purpose. Growing up in a small neighborhood in New Jersey, he'd admired anyone who served. Police, firefighters, correction officers. People who ran toward danger instead of away from it. When he got the job at Rikers Island, he thought it was a chance to do something meaningful. The academy instructors told him the same thing. You're the thin line between order and chaos. But the moment he stepped through the gates of Rikers, he realized that the chaos wasn't waiting for him inside the cells. It was walking beside him. The first sign came during orientation. A veteran officer named Torres took one look at Manuel's pressed uniform and nervous smile and said, "Rule number 1, see nothing. Rule number 2, say nothing. Rule number 3, if you forget the first 2, you won't last a week." The other rookies laughed. Manuel didn't. On his second day, he was assigned to a housing unit known for constant fights. He entered the floor expecting tension, but what he found was far more unsettling. The inmates weren't looking at him with fear or hostility. They were looking past him toward the two officers leaning casually near the control booth. One inmate whispered to another, "New kid, don't know nothing yet." And the smirk they exchanged wasn't about Manuel being inexperienced. It was about him being uncorrupted. Later that week, Manuel saw things that didn't line up with the training lectures or the department handbook. A search team found a razor under the mattress of an inmate who'd just filed a complaint against an officer. Another man showed up with a swollen jaw, and the sergeant wrote it off as slipped in the shower. A young detainee whispered to Manuel that the officers let gangs enforce discipline whenever they didn't feel like writing paperwork. And the worst part? The officers bragged about it, quietly but confidently. Still, Manuel tried to do the job the right way. He followed the rules. He reported incidents accurately. He treated inmates like people, not targets. And that made him stand out in all the wrong ways. The whispers started behind his back. Boy Scout, snitch lover, academy robot. They joked that he took notes like a journalist. They said he'd be writing books about them next. But the real shift happened one night when Manuel was assigned to help transport an inmate to the clinic. The man was limping, barely able to stand. When Manuel asked what happened, the inmate muttered, "Ask your boys in C block." One of the senior officers, Green, shot Manuel a look sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't go asking questions," Green warned. "This place runs on understanding, not curiosity." Yet curiosity was exactly what Manuel had. It ate at him, day after day, while he watched inmates walking around with unexplained bruises and busted lips. It gnawed at him when he saw supervisors clearing reports before officers even filled them out. And it burned inside him when he heard rumors of officers smuggling in contraband for money, alliances, or just because they could. Manuel wasn't naive. He knew every institution had flaws, but the sheer brazenness of it, the way everyone seemed to accept the corruption as part of the job, made it impossible for him to stay quiet. He began writing down what he saw. Dates, times, conversations, names. He told himself it was just so he wouldn't forget. But the truth was simpler. He couldn't shake the feeling that one day someone would need proof. And then came the night that changed everything. A code was called in one of the dorms, the kind that usually meant a fight or a medical emergency. Manuel ran with the others, but when he reached the doorway, he froze. Inside, 2 officers were on top of an inmate, fists flying, long after the inmate had stopped resisting. Blood smeared the tiles. One officer looked up, saw Manuel standing there, and snarled, "Get in here and shut the door." That was the moment Manuel realized he had walked into something he was never meant to witness. What he didn't know yet was that this incident, the one carved into his memory with the sound of fists hitting bone, would become the first page of a story that would spiral into retaliation, danger, and a cover-up bigger than he ever imagined. The beating in the dorm wouldn't leave Manuel's mind. Long after he went home that night, he could still hear the wet, sickening thud of fists hitting a body that had already gone limp. He replayed the moment he stepped through the doorway, how the officers didn't even stop when they noticed him watching. That was when something clicked. They weren't afraid of consequences. They weren't afraid of being reported. They weren't afraid of anything, because in their minds, nothing would happen. The system would protect them. The next morning, Manuel walked into roll call with a knot in his stomach. The room felt colder, heavier. The officers involved in the incident stood together in the corner, speaking quietly until they noticed him. Then they fell silent. One of them, Officer Braddock, stared at him with a smile, too controlled to be friendly. "You sleep good, rookie?" he asked. Manuel nearly answered, but stopped himself. Braddock didn't want conversation. He wanted a reaction. Later, a sergeant pulled Manuel aside. "About last night," he said, adjusting the clipboard in his hands. "Your report goes through me first. Keep it simple." Inmate was resisting, necessary force applied. "That's it." Manuel blinked. But that's not what happened. The sergeant sighed, the kind of sigh that wasn't tired, just done with people like him. "Look, Calvelos, you're new. You don't know how this works yet. Stick to the script. Don't complicate things." But the truth clawed inside him. What script? How many things had been hidden behind that script? That night, Manuel sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the blank space on his official incident report while his secret notebook sat open beside him. The words he wrote in that notebook flowed fast, frantic, as if fear were guiding his pen. 2 officers, Braddock and Hensley. Inmate name, Watkins. Time, 2013 hours. Force used long after compliance. No justification. Possible cover-up. He wrote until his hand cramped. When he returned to work, the atmosphere had shifted. Officers who once ignored him were now watching him. Conversations stopped when he approached. His radio crackled with static whenever he tried to call in for routine checks. A lieutenant joked loudly about rats in uniform, never looking directly at him, but making sure he was close enough to hear. Then came the first incident of retaliation. During evening rounds, Manuel returned to his locker and found it hanging open. The lock had been snapped clean off. Inside, his personal items were scattered across the metal floor. Uniform shirts stomped on, paperwork torn, and his lunch smashed like someone had punched through the container. A single razor blade lay on top of his folded undershirt. Not hidden, not subtle, placed. A message, clear as day. He reported it to his supervisor, but the sergeant only shrugged. "Probably forgot to lock it." "Happens." "I didn't forget," Manuel insisted. The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "You accusing someone of tampering with your locker?" "Got proof." Manuel didn't. But that wasn't the point. They wanted him unsettled, afraid, off balance. And it was working. A week later, an inmate passed him a folded piece of paper during meal distribution. Manuel almost crumpled it without reading. Notes from inmates usually meant threats, requests, or nonsense. But something made him open it. Inside was one sentence. "They ain't mad you saw it. They mad you didn't join in." His pulse spiked. He scanned the floor, but the inmate who handed it to him was already walking away, head down. That night, Manuel couldn't sleep. He kept hearing that line over and over. He knew what it meant. The officers weren't worried he witnessed the assault. They were angry he didn't participate in it. That meant they expected him to follow their code, not the department's. And if he didn't follow that code, he was a threat. The next morning confirmed it. When he walked into the staff parking lot, sunlight glinted off something on the ground near his car. He stepped closer. Glass. His windshield had been shattered, cracks radiating out like a spiderweb. On the driver's seat, sitting neatly on top of the broken glass, was another message, this time written in thick black marker on a torn corner of a DOC memo sheet. Mind your business. That was the moment Manuel realized he was no longer just witnessing corruption. He was inside its crosshairs. And the line between inmate and officer wasn't the dangerous one. The real danger was standing right beside him, wearing the same uniform. The retaliation didn't slow Manuel down, it intensified. Every shift felt like walking into a labyrinth where every corner held a new threat. But instead of scaring him into silence, it pushed him toward a decision he never imagined he'd have to make. He was going to report everything. Not just the beating, not just the threats. The entire pattern of misconduct poisoning the facility from the inside out. But reporting corruption at Rikers wasn't as simple as filling out a form. There were layers, protocols designed to look legitimate on paper, but to bury complaints in reality. Manuel learned that quickly when he contacted the Internal Affairs Office for the Department of Correction. The investigator he spoke to sounded bored, disinterested, asking the kind of slow, dragging questions that made it clear this wasn't their first time brushing someone off. "We'll look into it," the investigator finally said, in a tone that promised the opposite. Still, Manuel pressed on. He submitted written statements. He included dates, names, and details. He wrote about the razor planted in a detainee's bed after he complained about an officer. He described the injuries he'd seen labeled as slip and falls. He sent in the note left in his pocket, the one that read "Mind your business," and explained how his car had been vandalized on DOC property. But the more he reported, the worse things became. On a frigid morning shift, Manuel arrived early only to find his locker vandalized again, this time with his notebook missing. His heart dropped into his stomach. That notebook held everything. Weeks of observations. Evidence he'd hoped would protect him. It was gone. He searched every corner of the locker room, every trash bin, even the hallway floors. Nothing. Whoever took it didn't do it on impulse. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Later that day, as he walked through the corridor toward the officer's lounge, a voice called out from behind him. "Hey, Boy Scout." It was Officer Braddock, leaning against the wall with a smirk too wide to hide the threat buried underneath it. "Lose something." Manuel's blood went cold. Braddock didn't say another word. He didn't have to. Word spread quickly that Manuel had gone to the suits, that he'd filed complaints with Internal Affairs. Officers who previously ignored him now treated him with open hostility. Radio calls excluding him. Assignments to the worst posts. Supervisors suddenly becoming too busy to review his paperwork. Even inmates could sense the shift. One older detainee whispered, "Be careful, CO. They don't like your type here." The danger became more obvious one night during a routine count. The lights dimmed slightly, normal for the evening setting, but when Manuel reached the far end of the hallway, the lights flickered and went out completely. The emergency bulbs hummed faintly, barely illuminating the space. He turned to call it in on his radio. Static. Not even a hiss, just dead air. He tried again. Nothing. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, heavy, deliberate. He turned, expecting to see an inmate out of place, but instead Officer Hensley stepped out of the shadows. His expression was blank, unreadable. "You walk too slow, rookie," he muttered, but there was something off in his voice. A coldness. "Lights are out on this tier," Manuel said, trying to keep his tone steady. Hensley shrugged. "Power glitch. Happens." He took a step closer. "But I figure you know by now, some glitches aren't accidents." Before Manuel could respond, the lights snapped back on, bright and blinding. Hensley walked away without another word. That night, As Manuel drove home with adrenaline still surging through his veins, his phone buzzed with an email notification. It was a message from Internal Affairs. The subject line made his heart sink. Preliminary review completed, no action required. They had dismissed his entire report. Every detail, every incident, every threat. But the message was worse than a dismissal. Attached at the bottom was something he never expected to see. His full complaint, names included, had been forwarded to his facility's command staff for review. They hadn't protected him. They had exposed him. The next morning, as Manuel stepped through the main gate of Rikers Island, every eye in the corridor seemed to follow him. Officers stood in small groups whispering. A captain watched him walk by with a stare that could slice concrete. And then he saw it. Taped directly onto his locker door, in bold black marker, were 3 words. "We know everything." Manuel Calvelos realized that staying quiet wasn't an option anymore. Every shift now carried a palpable tension, a quiet menace that followed him like a shadow. He could no longer pretend that Rikers was just a workplace. It was a battlefield, and the enemy wore the same uniform as him. The threats were no longer subtle. They were intentional, calculated, and escalating. One morning, as Manuel made his way through the corridor, he noticed the faintest trace of smoke curling from the janitor's closet near the control booth. At first, he thought it was an electrical issue. But then he heard whispers, officers laughing quietly, glancing in his direction. He realized someone had tried to intimidate him, to unsettle him, maybe even to scare him off entirely. The retaliation became physical. During a routine check in the dorm, Manuel was cornered by Braddock and Hensley, the same officers who had been involved in the original beating. They didn't strike him, not yet, but they shoved him hard into the wall, leaving bruises on his ribs. "You're making waves, rookie," Braddock hissed. "And the water's about to get dangerous." Manuel's mind raced. He knew he was risking everything, his career, his safety, maybe even his life, but he couldn't stop. He started compiling everything he had into a detailed record. Dates, times, witness statements, incidents. He made copies, hid them in his apartment, and emailed summaries to journalists he trusted. It was dangerous, reckless even, but it was the only way the truth might see daylight. Then came the day that changed the game entirely. A detainee who had witnessed one of the beatings approached Manuel quietly during evening meal distribution. The man whispered, "They know you're talking. They've already decided what happens next." The look in his eyes was desperate, almost pleading. He disappeared into the shadows before Manuel could ask more. The weeks that followed were relentless. Someone broke into Manuel's apartment while he was at work. Papers were torn, belongings scattered, personal items stolen. But his notebook, the one that held every detail of the corruption, was untouched. The message was clear. They could intimidate him, but they couldn't yet stop him from exposing the truth. Inside Rikers, the atmosphere had grown toxic. Officers who once tolerated him now ignored his existence entirely. Or worse, taunted him with knowing glances. His radio calls were sabotaged, security cameras malfunctioned during his posts, and he was assigned to the most dangerous dorms without backup. Every moment felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. And yet, Manuel pressed on. He spoke to more journalists, submitted more complaints, and slowly, quietly, the web of corruption began to unravel. Stories of planted evidence, unreported assaults, and officer misconduct started to appear in small local news articles. Every report made him a target, but it also gave him hope that change was possible. The final straw came when a captain cornered him in the hallway, slammed a file against his chest, and said in a low, dangerous voice, "You think you're exposing corruption? You're just painting a target on yourself. Watch your back, Calvelos. This isn't about being right. This is about surviving." Manuel's pulse surged. The truth was heavier than he ever imagined. Rikers Island wasn't just a prison. It was a fortress of secrets, a machine that chewed up anyone brave enough to challenge it. Yet for Manuel, the choice was clear: stay silent and survive, or speak out and risk everything. What Manuel didn't know was that the storm he had ignited was about to reach a tipping point, one that would expose the darkest corners of Rikers Island in ways no one, not even him, could have anticipated. The storm Manuel Calvelos had ignited finally hit its peak. Every report, every note, every whispered warning had led to this moment. The truth he had risked everything to uncover was now unstoppable. Investigative journalists picked up his records, and soon local news outlets began publishing stories of violence, cover-ups, and intimidation at Rikers Island. The images, the dates, the accounts, it all hit the public with the force of a hammer. Inside the facility, tension reached a breaking point. Officers who had once targeted him were suddenly exposed, some suspended, others investigated. The administration scrambled to contain the fallout, but it was too late. Manuel's meticulous documentation left them no wiggle room. His bravery had pierced the armor of a system built on fear and silence. Manuel himself faced both relief and terror. Relief because the truth was finally being heard. Terror because he knew the men who had threatened him still walked the halls, watching, waiting. But something had changed. The culture that had protected misconduct for so long was starting to crack. Change was slow but visible. Policies were reviewed, oversight increased, and for the first time in decades, inmates and officers alike began to see that accountability was possible. In the end, Manuel didn't become a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't win awards or receive public accolades. What he did was far more dangerous and far more impactful. He chose truth over safety, evidence over silence. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that courage isn't loud. It's relentless, quiet, and unyielding, even in the face of unimaginable danger. And that is the legacy of Manuel Calvelos, the whistleblower who dared to expose corruption at one of the most feared prisons in America, whose actions forced the system to confront itself, and who showed that one person's bravery can ignite a movement that no threat, no intimidation, and no darkness can completely extinguish. If this story gripped you, shocked you, or made you see the hidden realities of our justice system, hit that like button, subscribe for more real-life true crime stories, and drop a comment to share your thoughts. Every share helps the truth reach more people, and every subscription joins you to a community that refuses to turn a blind eye. Don't just watch, be part of the story.